Z-I-O-N, Zion, which of course refers to Jewish beliefs into Jerusalem and Mount Zion and all like that. This is S-I-O-N, Sion, which ties it more to the Priory of Sion, and seems then that the original work of this protocols, which by the way is nothing less than a plan for taking over the world, and it ties it more to the Illuminati.
And even just as you spoke, I typed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it's popping up with so many different websites, some of which seem dedicated to prolonging this myth that this was somehow an actual artifact of the Jewish conspiracy, so-called Jewish conspiracy.
Right,
many more websites dedicated to debunking it too.
Right, and Ian, I think I can say without any fear of being disproved that being used as an anti-Semitic track, it was all twisted around and used as propaganda by the Russians, by the Tsar secret police prior to World War I, and some people who can't seem to get past that in their research take it as some kind of plan by the international Jewish conspiracy, which hopefully early in the program we laid to rest.
Yes, and I appreciate the efforts you did in the book as well. Well, let me see if we can't work quickly in and getting Rick in from Lexington, the station there that also runs my other program during the week, and that can be heard on some of these stations from Monday through Friday at different times. Rick, thanks for joining us, Coast to Coast AM. You're talking with Jim Mars.
Yes, Mr. Mars, it's a privilege. Mr. Punnett, I wish you had more than one night.
Oh, thank you, you're kind. Rick, Mike's doing a great job.
Yes, he is. But, Mr. Mars,
yes.
To your knowledge, is there any connection between the knowledge of the Knights Templar and the ancient Sumerian text that Zechariah Sitchin speaks of?
What?
Absolutely. I think you're getting ahead of the program, though.
He sure is. You hit it right, but and why don't you listen for the rest of this answer here, Rick, because why don't you address quickly about Sumer, because that also plays a central part in this discussion of the ancient mysteries.
Well, it's been said that all roads lead to Sumer, or Sumeria, as is also known. And a lot of people, particularly modern people and young people today, have barely even heard of Sumeria. And in fact, up until just about the beginning of the 20th century, I'm having problems saying this century, meaning 1900 till now.
It still is this century, remember.
I guess actually it is until next year.
You're okay.
But a lot of people up until this century truly believe that the most ancient civilization was the Egyptians, and yet careful study shows that the Egyptian civilizations was nothing more than remnants and carry-ons from the old Sumerian civilization, which existed like 6,000 years ago in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley over in what today is known as Iraq. And, Ian, it's kind of an interesting thing to me, too, that Iraq is one of the few places in the world today where we can't go.
Yeah.
And yet that seems to be the true cradle of human civilization. And, of course, what Rick was talking about is that in the 1800s, when they finally were just beginning to become aware of the Sumerian civilization, and what's fascinating is that actually we can know more about these Sumerians of 6,000 years ago than we'll probably ever know about the Egyptians or even the Romans, for that matter, because they wrote down their histories and their knowledge in cuneiform on clay tablets, which were then baked and turned into stone, essentially. And these tablets still exist. So we have this written history that existed about 3,000 years before the Bible was ever even written down. But we didn't know that up until the last 100 years. And in the 1800s, when they began to translate these ancient cuneiform tablets, they read about gods that came from the sky and colonized and set up civilizations, and then created people through DNA manipulation, genetic experiments, and stuff like that. But they didn't have any knowledge of that. They didn't even know that heavier than air flight was possible in the 1800s. And so they wrote all this off as, well, this was their mythology. And unfortunately, because it got put into books, it's still in the encyclopedias, and today we are still told that these were their mythical gods, okay? Well, more recent scholars, and with Zecharia Sitchin leading the way, have now simply taken a simple twist of the mindset, which is maybe these weren't just mythologies that they just made up as funny stories. Maybe they were putting down truth as they understood it. And if you take it from that tact, then all of a sudden we have a whole new view of our history.
We'll come back. Evelyn is hanging on, and Colette, and I hope you too, for your chance to talk with Jim Marrs and get your questions answered, or if you're like me when it comes to secret societies, to get your itch scratched by the guy that knows it all. Rule by Secrecy is the new book by Jim Marrs, and you're coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. My name's Ian Punnett. We have one more hour to go with Jim Marrs, Rule by Secrecy, and we promise we'll get to the long-awaited ancient mysteries which sort of undergird the development of these secret societies and become the object, in many cases, of the heritage that these organizations pass on to each other. But first, let's get a few more callers, and Evelyn is listening in Vancouver, British Columbia. And welcome to Coast AM, Evelyn, or is it Evelyn in your part of the world?
No, it's Evelyn.
Okay, just checking. Yeah, I know. When I see British and Evelyn, I never quite know. And this is Jim Marrs. Evelyn?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Good, thanks. I had a statement and then a question. In about around the beginning of the 80s, somewhere in there, I went to a trance channeler, and for some other reason. But in the message that I got, it had to do with the Fabians, the Illuminati, the secret society, and I was just sort of tapping my toe through all of this, thinking this is not what I paid this person for. And all this information was coming to me, forces of darkness, da-da-da-da-da, and that I was a light worker, and on and on and on. So that's fine. I left there, and the strange thing was what this person was saying to me was things that I felt that I did know, but within this lifetime I can't tell you why I would know it. And after that, it seemed that I couldn't go anywhere for years, actually, that like a book would fall off a shelf in a bookstore, and it would have to do with Illuminati or some secret societies. One time, a fellow that I knew, not that well, but had been over for some business, and he was in a band, and he had been playing in Hong Kong, I think it was, and I was relating this story to him about what I had been through, and he just looks at me very strangely, and he goes to his briefcase, and he opens it up, and there's more information for me on this. This time it had to do with the bankings, and a Mason who was murdered over this information that he was showing me at this time. And so this went on, and I couldn't turn around without getting some information on this. And through the years, I've just said, well, I don't know why this information came to me, but just put it aside and don't worry about it. But no sooner do I do that than it comes back into my life.
We may need to cut to the question
Okay,
here.
my question is, what is one supposed to do with this knowledge? Like if it is an evil source, like half a dozen people ruling the world type of thing, like what are we supposed to do about it?
Okay, well, first let me say that since somebody has identified you as a light worker, you might be interested to know that historically, the definition of light actually means knowledge. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to become a light worker, then you're going to be a worker for knowledge. And so all I can say to you is just open your mind, open your heart, study, read everything you can get your hands on. Start putting two and two together. Now, once you have the knowledge, then you're going to turn around and you're going to perhaps use it in a more realistic manner today. For example, the President of the United States today is Bill Clinton, who, as we all know, was a Rhodes Scholar. Well, Cecil Rhodes was funded by the bankers in Europe and created, through his vast wealth, a group of secret societies known as the Round Tables.
The Freemasons and the Great Pyramids, and we will connect all of these discussions back to the ancient mysteries at the end of this hour, not to be missed. And it is so central to the whole raison d'etre, if you will, for these organizations. Their whole reason for being, in many cases, was just the protection of these ancient mysteries. That it'll be fun to unveil them for some people with whom none of this material is all that familiar. And we go back to the phones. Standing by is several people to talk to Jim Mars. Colette in Hamilton, joining us on Coast to Coast AM. Colette?
Good morning, Ian.
You're talking to Jim Mars.
Oh, good morning, Jim. How do I spell your name if I'm looking on the website?
It's Jim, and then Mars, like the planet, but with an extra R. Marrs.
Oh, thank you, because there's MEAGHER and all sorts of things. Okay, first of all, I just wanted to know, are you familiar with Yallop's book, In God's Name, about the murder of the Pope previous to this one?
Yes, somewhat, and that's a whole interesting topic right there.
Yes,
I'm very familiar with it, actually.
Malachi Martin went into it too, very clearly.
I know that material well, and that's a fascinating book.
Incredible.
About the death of John Paul I.
Well, not only that, but they are carrying on Masonic rituals in the Vatican at the moment while this Pope is there. So they're after the wealth. The other thing I wanted to say was I have studied world religions and history for 4 years, and I have come across the Babylonian Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we had a professor who was able to translate some of the cuneiform, which was marvelous. I've studied under the Jewish professors the history of Judaism, and they are not at all dismayed or fooled by the fact that the Elders of Zion might have been produced by a Jew, and that it is absolutely an attempt to twist everything. The other one I wanted to say was the P2, which extends from Portugal, Spain, right across through Europe, and even into Russia. And Hitler's obsession with the occult is very well known to people who study this. He also went crazy when he saw the spear that was in Nuremberg and didn't settle until he got his hands on it. And he said the day he didn't have it, he would be defeated. And strangely enough, it was bombed out just a couple of days before he died.
You're speaking of the Spear of Longinus.
Spear, I'm sorry, yes, the spear,
right.
Yes. That's
covered in my book also.
Well, listen, I'm going to get that book because I have 3 pages of notes here since I started listening.
Good. Well,
and I want to get into this and get it all tied together, and I'm looking forward to it, okay?
Thank you, Colette. In fact, Jim, let's go ahead and talk just a little bit more about Hitler in that sense and reinforce what Colette was saying there. In fact, I looked it up, and I didn't even realize that in 1993, a Russian court had found officially and for all time that the protocols of Zion were, in fact, just an anti-Semitic twisting that had been done, as you had stipulated earlier.
Right.
But what even more interesting for me is just, we've talked about Hitler and the occult, and his fascination that I hadn't really realized. I thought it was just an act of sort of the whole idea of Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant. I thought it was really an act of pure fiction, but it really isn't. I mean,
no,
that really...
It's not. In fact, the Nazis actually did go all around the world. They made expeditions to Tibet. They excavated extensively in southern France, in the area where the Priory of Zion is. They were most fascinated and interested in all of this.
Why did they feel this kinship with the Tibetans, of all people?
Well, because I think that we're going to find that all throughout the world, in Tibet, in China, in India, even in Australia with the Aborigines, in Africa, we find throughout the world the ancient legends are all the same, and they all mention the gods that come from the sky and fly through the air.
We'll get to Frank here from New Jersey, who's been waiting patiently for his opportunity to talk with Jim Mars, Rule by Secrecy. Frank, welcome to Coast AM.
All right. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Frank.
I have a point of disagreement with you, sir.
That's fine.
And on that point is that the Fuhrer, in the last book, written supposedly from tapes that he made his last week of life, he plainly lays forth that it was his will his personal charisma that drove the Nazi Party. He was not the pawn of any organization. Just on that point, I have a disagreement that I believe that he did have the demonic will to do the things that he did. And I have a question for you also, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard anything, this deals with a modern subject, the Fraternal Order of Police of all people, and the military group from Fort Riley, Kansas, at the correctional training facility known as the Cadre. Have you ever heard of their plans to subjugate the Constitution of the United States and to overthrow us and put us under martial law?
Only vaguely. I'll have to be honest and say that I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but of course, you don't need a secret cadre to do that. We already have the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which under numerous presidential orders and special guidelines are poised. They can take control anytime the President of the United States wants to declare a national emergency.
Right. Are you familiar that the FOP and the Cadre also formed the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, and that they back all political candidates in the United States, either as the FOP or the partnership?
Well, no, I don't know that as a fact, but then that's, of course, is standard operating procedure among all the secret societies, which is to back both sides and control it no matter who takes over.
Right. Well, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate
the show.
I'm glad you're jumping in there. I want to go back to his comment, though, about Hitler. I was unfamiliar with this work that was published apparently on from material provided from the last week in his life. Do you know anything about that, Jim?
Well, there was supposedly the last will of Hitler, but I'm not certain that that's ever been absolutely authenticated.
Yeah.
Also, as far as some of Hitler's belief, I would invite Frank and anybody else that wants to get into that to really study a person by the name of Dietrich Eckhart. Dietrich Eckhart was a very prominent member of several secret societies, including the Thule Society, and Hitler named him as being one of his supreme guides, and Eckhart, before he died back in the 20s, said, follow Hitler because although he dances the dance, I'm the one who calls the tune, and he speaks of the secret doctrine.
Yeah, I've been following and reading about Hitler for years, and I've never heard of a book that was published that was, based on what his last will is, and if it is material that is authentic, that was, culled from recordings that he had made, or things that had been recorded that he had said, I would also be suspicious of the motivation of those recordings that would be intended to exculpate anybody else in his tracks. That for him to take the blame doesn't necessarily mean that the blame should all have just been his. We'll come back with more of your questions, though, for author Jim Marrs, Rule by Secrecy. We're doing, I think we're doing journeyman work here in clearing up some of the less than ancient mysteries about secret societies. Coming up at the end of the hour, we will get to the very ancient mysteries themselves. My name is Ian Punnett, and this is Coast to Coast AM.
This is Coast to Coast AM. To talk with
the Rockies, Gary is waiting in Maryland for his chance to talk with Jim Marrs, author of Rule by Secrecy. Gary?
Hello, Ian.
Thanks for hanging on. You're on Coast to Coast.
Jim, I got two questions for you, and then I'll hang up and I'll listen to the answers on the air, please. My first question to you, Jim, is what is your take on, there was a pyramid that was opened up over there in Egypt, and the hieroglyphics in there had pictures of flying craft that they called the Atlantis Connection. And the second question is last year they had one of these high-resolution satellites take photographs of Noah's Ark up there on Mount Ararat, and how come them pictures haven't been made public? Thank you, Jim.
Jim?
Right, good questions. Number one, the drawings that were found in a pyramid that are dated back for thousands of years and seem to show flying machines. One of them even looks to me, for all the world, like an Apache attack helicopter. And yes, I have checked those out. They are real. They are there. And I do talk about that in my new book, Rule by Secrecy. Now, to the pictures of the seems to be some sort of craft up on Mount Ararat. I might point out that one of the callers called in and talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was an ancient Babylonian story or legend. And I might point out, too, that that even goes further back, again, back to the Sumerians, who had their own story of a great flood and a person who was warned by his God to build an ark and to seal it with pitch so that he could survive this great flood. And in the ancient Sumerian stone tablets, where do you think they said that this Sumerian ark came to rest? On Mount Ararat. Isn't that fascinating?
Well,
now, why is it that we don't know more about all this? Well, simply put, it's because we're not being told about this by the mass media, which are now owned by 3 or 4 corporations, which are controlled and owned by the very members of these secret societies that I'm writing about.
Well, I want to take issue with part of that and say that part of the... I would argue that there has never been a time when more people have been creating more media outside of the control of any corporate worldview. And if you go online, if you go on the internet, it's difficult to find any place where news can actually be suppressed. That if it's actual bona fide news, somebody somewhere is going to be putting it. More than likely, even if it just has a nugget of truth in it, you'll find people that can, blow a whole website up out of something which may only have a grain of truth at its core. In terms of the Mount Ararat photography, there are plenty of Bible archaeology journals where this material can be researched quite easily, and I would recommend to Gary that he go to a library and start looking in those places. If you're not satisfied that ABC, NBC, or CBS aren't telling you what's on top of Mount Ararat, it's possible because there just may not be that big a story there. Part of that problem has just been that this has been nothing new, that they've been looking for the ark for so long on top of the mountain. There's a point where you have to decide whether or not every bit of wood that's ever found on top of the mountain ever turns out to be able to be authenticated. Frequently, when they've been able to carbon date a piece of wood, it doesn't go anywhere near far that back. But take a look at Bible archaeology journals for more on that. Jim?
You're absolutely right, and you're right. There are all kinds of alternative sources of information, and I encourage all your listeners to avail themselves of it. My point is, though, is that they don't care if a handful of people know something. What they're concerned about is the great bulk of the public learning something in an overnight fashion, so that there might be a groundswell demand that something be done or something be investigated, and that gets back to the mass media, the networks, and the major cable stations and networks and all like that. And let me explain about because a lot of people don't understand this. I'm not so paranoid as to think that every editor, every reporter, every researcher in this country is being suppressed and shut out by some schemers or conspirators. I worked in the media for a quarter of a century. I know how it works. No, that's not true. But there is control over the distribution of the information. I'm right now in Hawaii and out here on business. And the lead story, the banner headline in the newspapers out here is how Chevron Corporation lied to the state about its pricing system. And I guarantee you, I bet you a dime against a donut that story does not appear in my home state of Texas, which of course is largely run by gas and oil interest.
It's a fair point, and it speaks to the essence of Rule by Secrecy. Jim Marrs, the author, taking a few more questions, and then we'll get into the ancient mysteries coming up. And I hope that this opportunity that you all have to talk with Jim won't be your last, too. We'll give you the website information where you can contact Jim off the air, and more about his downloadable ebook, which is coming out shortly as well, next on Coast to Coast AM. Jim Mars, author of Rule by Secrecy. And Jim, before I forget, and I don't want to just kind of jam it in at the end, go ahead and give out your website and the website, too, for where your newest book, this e-book, can be read by your fans this week.
Okay, thank you. The book we've been talking about, Rule by Secrecy, should be available in every major bookstore. If they don't have it, just order it. They can get it really quick. The new book that's coming out is a book that I wrote back several years ago that is the history and the inner view of what happened with the development of remote viewing, of course, which is a subject, of course, that I and Art Bell and many other people have been very, very fascinated with. And this was a book that I feel like was suppressed. It was stopped in 1995, even as it was going to the press by a major publisher in New York. And now it's available as a downloading book from alienzoo.com. Just go there and you can learn all about that. And if you can't remember that, then I do have a website of a sort called jimmars.com, and that can lead you to other places.
The ancient mysteries we'll leave time for here at the very end. Let's see if we can't get a few more questions answered about secret societies in the interim. And hanging on for a question from Miami is Ed for Jim Mars on Coast to Coast AM. Ed?
Yes, to both of you. In the year of 1964, I lived in Philadelphia. In order to enter Mercy Hospital there, I had to enter under the disguise of a study program, I studied psychotropic medications. While there, I did random study on the Trilateral Commission, the Blue Book, and the Bilderbergers, and I found out that they're instrumental in building a supercomputer in Europe. Do you know anything at all about that? I like your response.
Jim?
Well, first, let me preface this by saying that I can't give you any hard and fast, concrete knowledge, but I've heard those same stories. What I found really interesting is that some years ago, I became aware that there was a supercomputer in Europe and a supercomputer in the United States, and one more that I found out that was behind what was then the Iron Curtain. And interestingly enough, these computers were, and I'm not sure why, but they were designated as a number 6 computer. And I've had several people wonder if perhaps this might not mean the 3 major 6 computers could be the 666 that we hear so much about. I don't really know, but I just thought that was very interesting.
It's ironic that all this happened during the LBJ administration.
Well, not ironic to Jim.
That's true, because, of course, under the LBJ administration, we got some very positive social programs, but I think they were used to mask what was really going on, which, of course, was the Vietnam War.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Ed, and let's get to Lawrence in Ellensburg, Washington for Jim Mars.
Hi, Ian. I'm glad you got a piece of the Coast to Coast pie.
Oh, good.
You're
I'm
my
enjoying
choice
it.
to replace art.
Well, I'm enjoying it immensely. Thank you.
I just wanted to talk to Jim. I bought his book, Alien Agenda, after he was on the show the last time, and it was kind of the history of all theories ever thought about aliens. And I was wondering if this current book is kind of the same sort of survey. And I never did figure out what exactly aliens are doing here. And I was wondering if the current book is available in paperback or not yet.
Okay. First off, no, it's not available in paperback just yet because it's just now come out in a hard cover edition. But I might say that you might want to get the hardcover because I think that Rule by Secrecy is one of these books that you're going to want to keep on your shelf and go back and refer to many, many, many times. As to the connection with Alien Agenda, that's really interesting that you brought that up because actually Rule by Secrecy is kind of an outgrowth of my book Alien Agenda, which was a nonfiction overview of the UFO situation. After I wrote that, and in fact in an appendix to Alien Agenda was a little chapter that I entitled Take Me to Your Leader. We all know the familiar stereotype of the little guy that gets out of the saucer and says, "Take me to your leader." Well, my editor at HarperCollins, which is publishing Rule by Secrecy, asked me, well, who is our leader? who really runs the world? And I took that and said, that's very interesting, and that's when I began to set out and research and develop the information that I've now put in my book, Rule by Secrecy.
Lawrence, I think you'll enjoy it quite a bit. Let me get to Aaron